Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another video, and in this video we are going to be continuing on with our tutorial series for C#. And in this tutorial we are going to be covering how we go about declaring and initializing variables and constants in C#. So, what exactly are variables? Well, if you remember back from math class, when you back in school, they are essentially placeholders that contain a value, right? So you could have x, and that represent 3 or even a string of a string of characters in the case of programming. So in this video, we're going to talk about how the different types that we can use to create variables, the various ways of creating variables, and the different nuances between the types. So the first thing I want to talk about are integers. Now, what are integers? Well, integers are essentially whole numbers. They can't contain decimal places or anything like that. They are simply whole numbers, right? And how do we go about creating an integer? Well, that's pretty simple. In Visual Studio, go ahead and type int. And int stands for integer. That is the keyword that we need to use when creating an integer. Next, we can hit space, and we need to give it a name. So let's say name. And we can then do a space and an equal sign and then another space. And here we need to give it a value. Now you can see name, it probably isn't a very good name for this variable. So let's go back and we'll call this name length. So we have the length of a name. And we'll say this is going to be the length of my first name. And that is technically 6 characters. So my full first name is 6 characters long. And then at the end of this line, you need to put a semicolon. And so that is how you can create a variable. Well, what if I want to see this variable, the value of this variable then, in the command line? What if when I run this app, I want to see it in the console? Well, remember from our first video where we looked at console write line? That we can use that here too. Instead of just a string, we can give it an integer. So we can say console.writeLine, opening and closing parenthesis, and a semicolon. And inside of the parentheses, all you need to give it is name length. Like that. And so now, when we go and do a Control F5, or we can go to debug. Start without debugging. Let it do its thing. And it should bring up that console. If not, okay, so I guess we have build errors. Let's take a look at our code. Okay. Okay, so far nothing there. Let's see here. Yeah. Okay. So this is a good opportunity to show you the error console in C#. I'm not going to shy away from errors. So it says we have a build error. Let's go ahead and go do and Control W and Control E. Control W, E. And so here we are. It does not look like we have any build errors. So Visual Studio is not being cooperative, I guess. So let's try something else. Let's see here. See here. Maybe. Okay. Okay, let's try it now. Now that I want one folder is gone. Control F5. There we go. And you can see now it printed out 6. And that's what we wanted. And to be clear, the error that we were getting was it found 2 program CS files. So I had to exclude the folder that I put the program CS file from the previous video in from the project, so it wouldn't so it wouldn't interfere. And then we were able to run it. So if that, for whatever reason, happens to you, that is what the solution is. Okay? So let's go back to our code editor, and we're going to delete this code now. So the next types I want to show you are double, decimal, and float. Now, these are both what are called floating point values, variable types, and they can include decimal places. However, the reason why we have 3 different types of floating point variables is because each of them have a different level of precision. So they can have much more decimal places depending on what type it is. Float is the least precise, so I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head what the maximum amount of decimal places is for a float, but it is the smallest. Floats you'll often see in games. They're very, very often used there. The next one is double. That is the middle most precision. And then decimal. Decimal is the most precise. It can have the most precision. You can define how many decimal places to the left or the right you want, maximum, and stuff like that. So how do we define a float then? Well, to define a float, you use the float keyword. So float, like that. You give it a name. Let's say x. And we will assign this a value of, say, 3.14. And a semicolon. Well, we have to actually have an F here at the end of that. Like that. Then, for the double, we can have a double keyword like that. We'll say x2. And we'll set that equal to 3.141. And make sure you have a semicolon. Right? So okay. So float. Come on. There we go. We'll say pi equals 3.14f. Then a double. Pi 2 equals 3.141. And then we can have a decimal. So in order to create a decimal variable, we need to use the decimal keyword. So decimal, and we'll say pi 3 equals 3.1415. And then for a decimal, you need to have an M. So put the M and then the semicolon. Perfect. And so those are the float, double, and decimal. If we want to put them into the console, we can do a console write line pi like that. And then a console write line pi 2. And then we can have a console dot write line pi 3 like that. And go ahead and do a control F5. And there you go. Right. So those are the floating point values that you can have. There are other integer types. So just to keep you guys informed on that, there are multiple integer types that you can have, as well as different floating point variable types you can have. But I'm not showing you the other integer types for the simple fact of it's not extremely often that you use the other integer types. So I'm going to let you guys go out to the C# documentation and learn about those on your own, because I feel like that would be a great learning opportunity for you, especially to be able to browse and read the documentation is super important. But so now that we've covered the integer type and the various floating point types that we have in C#, let's talk about strings. So a string is essentially a string of characters. And while we're at it, we'll also take a look at the character type, so that way you can kind of see the difference. So characters. Let's start with that. Characters are basically, well, a single character. They can be represented by using an int, an integer value, and that will tell C#, hey, use that number in the, I believe it's the UTF-8 character set to determine what character that is. You can also use Unicode strings as well. or you can just do straight up the actual character itself. So let's say we wanted to create a character that stores the middle initial of somebody. So let's say char. That's how you. The char keyword is how you create a character variable. So char, and we'll say middle initial equals, and then we need singular quotes. And inside of those single quotes, we can put the character. This can be a character representation of a number, a lowercase letter, uppercase letter, punctuation, whatever. We'll put a capital J. Because there's lots of people that have the middle initial of J. So this is how you create a character variable. It's relatively simple. If you put anything other than one character, and it's not like a Unicode string or anything like that in between those single quotes, you will get an error. So keep that in mind. Now let's say we want to create a string. So for, let's say, the full name of someone. We can say string, all lowercase, name, and we'll set that equal to, say, George Washington. Now you can see the difference between a character and a string is that a string can contain multiple characters, and a string uses double quotes instead of singular quotes. If you try to use single quotes with a string, you will get an error indicating that it cannot convert the type string, or basically it can't convert between a string and a character. So keep that in mind as you're going along. A string cannot be initialized with single quotes. It has to be double quotes. And as we go along in the series, especially when we talk about files, we use strings a little bit differently in various different scenarios. So you'll see how that works as we go along. But for now, just keep in mind this is the standard way of using a string. And if you want to go and print these values out to the console, you can go ahead and do a console write line, and you can say middle initial and console dot write line, and then you can have the name value in there. Okay, L-I-N-E. And name, like that. Okay, so we'll do that. Okay, and then you can run your code. And there you go. So now that we've talked about integers, floating point variables, strings and characters, we need to also talk about Booleans, right? So what is a Boolean? Well, a Boolean is essentially a true or false value. And that's all it can really be. It can only be true or false. Booleans are typically used for conditions. So when you want to test a specific condition, and we'll talk about conditional statements as we go forward. But for now, to initialize a Boolean variable in C#, we need to use the bool keyword. So B-O-O-L. And let's say we want a variable that holds whether or not, whether or not it's someone's birthday, right? So we can say is B-I-R-T-H-D-A-Y. So is birthday, and we can set that equal to false, let's say, because it is not, because it's not my birthday. If it was, we could also set it to true, like that. But because it's false, I'm going to leave it as false. And you can even print out booleans to the console by going console.writeLine is birthday. Go ahead and do a Control F5. And there you go. Right? So those are the different variable types that we can use in C#. Granted, of course, there are others, like I mentioned, like I mentioned, there are the different integer types that you can use. To kind of briefly talk about them, those are like unsigned integers. There's int 32, there's int 64, unsigned integers 32, an unsigned int 64, that kind of stuff. Like I said, you can go through the documentation if you need to look at those different types as you need them, or if you just want to have some extra knowledge on hand. That is extremely important. So now that we have that done, now that we've talked about that, those are the like I said, those are the different types, and that's how you can do that. Actually declaring the types themselves. But you can also define variables in a different way, using the var keyword, and var stands for variable. So let's say I want to create an integer that's called x and has a value of 10, but I don't want to use the integer, or rather the int keyword on its own. We want to use something else that doesn't explicitly define the type. Well, that's where the var keyword comes in. You can say var x, so var x equals 10, semicolon. And so now we have a variable called x that's equal to 10. But you may be asking, how does it know it's an integer or a double or a decimal or whatever, How does it know what its type is? Well, it knows because the C# compiler goes and infers the type. So by default here, it'll see that it's an integer, so it will interpret it as that. And you can see that if we go ahead and do a console.writeLine with an X there. Go ahead and do a Control F5. It'll run just fine. C#, the C# compiler automatically goes in, well, .NET, then it's CLR and all that stuff, goes in and, goes in and determines what type it is. So that's the var keyword. Now, what if we want to create constants? Like, let's say we have an application where we want the interest rate. We're calculating something that has to do with an interest rate. And we want this interest rate to be immutable. We don't want it to be changed by anything or anyone. And we can do that by using the const keyword. So in order to create a constant, let's call it interest rate, just for the sake of argument. And we'll set it to we'll set it to 0.1 or 0.01, something like that. So to do this, we can say const, and let's say this is a decimal. So const decimal interest rate equals 0.01 m semicolon, like that. All right. So we can have const interest rate equals 0.01 m, like that. Excuse me. Now you can see we didn't put the decimal in here. Decimal, like that. And there we go. Now we can go ahead and if we, let's say, we go ahead and do a console.writeLine interest rate, like that. We can go ahead and do a Control F5, and it runs again, and you can see it runs just fine. However, if let's say we try to modify it, right? Let's say we try to modify this. So we can say interest rate is now equal to 0.0001. You can see this isn't going to work, especially if we try to run it. We have some build errors. So let's go, and you can see in our error list, we have an error in there. And this is telling us that this must be a variable. Now, why is that? Well, a constant isn't a variable, it's a constant. It's a value that doesn't change. Variables are values that do change, right? So if you want something that changes, use a variable. If you don't, use a constant. So that pretty much does it for this video, guys, on variables and constants, as well as the different variable types that you can use in C#. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.